What in the world is this thing? I can't tell if it's some sort of spaceship. Must be some sort of ancient relic or something like that. Oh, no. I know what it is. They remade the 5150 plugin in real life. That's pretty sick. It actually looks exactly like the real plugin. The EVH 5150 Iconic behind me is the first tube amp I've ever owned in my 17 years of guitar playing. Despite all the buzz surrounding the amp at its time of release, because it was Eddie Van Halen's last involvement with EVH gear and the last amp they would ever collaborate with, rest in peace, the launch was a bit shaky, with the official EVH showcase of the amp not being really well received by many people, many passing it off as a vintagey sounding amp that can't really pull off the modern stuff. Never mind the fact that majority of these comments were made by people that never really owned the amp, probably can't play for shit. Today I'm going to be myth busting everything as someone who's literally never owned a real amp before, and I bet you I can make it sound good. I hope. Not including beginner practice amps and other monstrosities. For the past 5 years, I've pretty much been exclusively playing plugins and digital modelers from companies like Neuro DSP with their plugins and the Quad Cortex. So when EVH got in touch with me and sent this to my door, I didn't know what to do with it. I tried miking the cab up properly with no prior miking experience apart from like the virtual ones that you do in the plugins, and it sounded okay. I even ended up using it live with my Quad Cortex being fed through the effects loop on the back of the amp. That way I could run all my presets and effects like that through the actual cab, while also pushing out to front of house in parallel straight from the Quad Cortex. I am so used to the way that plugins sound that I feel as though I have no choice but to replicate them with the very amps that they're modeled after. Amp sims allow all the flexibility in the world, so to mimic that I've kind of had to source some tools to help me in that process. On the floor we have a Horizon Devices precision drive, which is perfect for tightening up the low end on my 7-string Jackson Misha Mansour ET7 signature, loaded with bare knuckle juggernauts, as well as the Fortin Zool Plus noise gate, which Fortin were actually kind enough to send over purely for this video. Thank you guys so much. This gate feels like cheating, honestly. The preamp out on the back of the 5150, which is a really nice feature by the way, not a lot of amps in that price range do that, is going straight into my interface so I can use a custom IR that I made using the GD Studio Cabs Cali suite. And to take things up a notch, I even bought an MXR 10 band EQ to run through the effects loop of the amp, just so I can sculpt my tone that little bit more and mimic the plugins where you have the EQ section in the plugin between the amp and the cab. Disclaimer, yes, EVH sent me this amp, although I'm under no contract obligation or anything like that to say anything good about it. They didn't even ask for a video, I just want to make one. So with all of that out the way, how does it sound in a mix? Before we get into how I made the tone, let's start from scratch. Without any noise gate, overdrive, or the EQ, this is what it sounds like coming straight out of the amp into the GGD custom IR. As you can hear, the tonal characteristics are very similar, although it lacks that clarity and punch. So let's turn on the overdrive, gate, and EQ to see how it compares. Going on to the actual amp settings, I've kept everything relatively close to noon because that's how I typically dial in my amps on the plugins and stuff. The gain is at 4 with the burn switch disengaged. The burn switch is kind of just like extra saturation, not that great for getting a clear tone out of a 7-string tuned to drop A flat, so it's turned off. The amp's built-in noise gate is turned all the way up. It does the job, but don't expect it to clamp as clean as the Fortin Zool does because that's just very tight and very nice. This is kind of just to get rid of that amp hiss, and it does that relatively well. Lows just below 5, mids at around 4, highs at just below 6. I really like bright tones. The volume knob, or like master knob, is turned just below 3 or around 3. I don't really want the amp to work too hard because it saturates the tone too much, and especially using a 7-string tuned this low, you want as much clarity as you can, so kind of turning that down. I find around 3, whether it's a plug-in or a real 5150, is kind of the sweet spot. And that's literally it. The inbuilt boost on the amp is disengaged. Things like reverb, presence, resonance, they only apply to the actual cab, not to the preamp out on the back of the amp. So that's literally it from the amp. The IR that I made on the GGD Cali suite is kind of an amalgamation of a Fredman technique, which is taking up the bulk of the tone, a normal 57, which is kind of adding some highs, and then a ribbon 121, which is kind of filling out that low end ever so slightly. Moving on to the pedals. Now the pedals are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of getting that tight modern tone, although if you were using a normal amp traditionally through a cab, you're going to be using these pedals anyway. They're sculpting the signal going into the amp to sound more tight and aggressive, which really makes it sound plug-in-y and kind of mix ready. The precision driver is set pretty standard for the model metal stuff, you know, attack knob at 2 out of 5, that's just like a low end filter. And then the volume's at around 7, tone is about the same, and then driver's pretty much all the way off with the inbuilt gate turned all the way up, because Gen. The Fortin Zool Plus noise gate is also a huge factor into getting that really pristine digital gated sound. The hold and release is set as tight as possible when the threshold's just below halfway, although that will vary depending on the gear that you're using. This is what works for me, and it pretty much works so that if I'm gliding my hands on the strings, it makes no noise, so it's relatively tight. Finally, the EQ. Now I find that this part is like the last piece of the puzzle in terms of getting your tone to sound mix ready and plug-in-y. Technically, this EQ is altering the preamp sound, not the cab sound after. So because it's running through the effects loop at the back of the amp, the preamp sound goes into the EQ, I sculpt it, then it goes into the cab, which in this case is the GGD Cali. The moves are really subtle and I don't really go any more than 3 dB either way. I've boosted around 60 and 125 ever so slightly just to bring back some of that tight bouncy response. I've dropped 250 and 500 Hertz a little bit because that's typically what I do with most of my rhythm tones. A lot of 5150s, especially this one, seem to have this very dominant like low mid thing happening, which is only exaggerated when you're using this type of gear playing this style of music, so I tend to shelve it out most of the time. A slight boost at 1K and 2K to kind of bring up the upper mid range and that perceived high end before it kind of gets a little bit ear picky around 4K, which is why I've dipped it at 4K, and then to compensate for that I've boosted up 8K ever so slightly. And that's just to give the overall tone a little bit of air. And that's it. That's how to make a real amp sound like a plug-in. Do you guys like the way that the 5150 Iconic sounds? Let me know in the comments below. If you guys like this video at any time, please feel free to leave a like and a comment on anything you saw or heard. And if you want to see more of this stuff, definitely think about subscribing. If you guys want to get your hands on the tabs, stems, DIs, drum tracks, all that good stuff to the demo song that you heard at the beginning of the video, you can definitely check out my Patreon. And if you guys want to support me further, you can check out all my affiliate links and web store. All that stuff will be down in the description below. Massive thank you to EVH and Fender for sending this over. Even though I don't play real amps that often, I am enjoying this a lot. And massive thank you to all my Patreons and everyone watching, because I would not be in the position to make videos like this without you guys. But until next time, I'll catch you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Ciao.